Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are in 2 Samuel chapter 3. What second Samuel spans the entire 40-year reign of David. So in these first few chapters, what we're seeing is the transition from the house of Saul to the house of David. Now, this is with difficulty. And I said this in the last study that we're going to also see why it was wise that Saul family be eliminated. God's choice was death. Now, but we're also going to see that there are people who will never ever get over Saul's removal. Now, those people are ungodly people. We will see that. Okay. But we're going to see now in terms of this establishing. Now, the first thing is, and you're going to see right in this first chapter why it was important for that, because had this not happened, David would never have had the kind of leadership, the reign that he needed to have. And then we'll see later with David's son Solomon how this wisdom will play out. More on that. We saw Abner, who was Saul's uncle, who tried to keep up the kingdom of Saul. So he takes Saul's son, Isabeth, and he actually installs him as king. Okay, installs him as king, and he reigned for about 2 years. The difference is that now, because God was on David's side, David increased in strength and Saul's household decreased. Okay. Now it's going to be interesting because you're going to see how, again, there's political alliances, political feelings, and then there's God's wisdom and God's choice, and they don't always mesh together. Even David, we're going to see here, even with this, that, how David's going to react to Abner's death. And Abner at one point, remember, did not support David. Let's get into it. Alright, so this is chapter 3, and this says the war between the house of Saul and the house of David was long and drew out, with David growing stronger and the house of Saul becoming weaker. Now remember, his Saul's son is now reigning in sort of some of the northern kingdoms, and David is reigning in the region of Judah, okay, in Hebron. Verse 2, the sons were born to David in Hebron. The firstborn was Amnon by Ahiman, the Jezreelite. His second was Chelip by Abigail, the widow of Nabal and Carmelite. The third was Absalom. We're gonna hear about him later. The son of Maacah, daughter of King Tamili of Gershur. The fourth was Adonijah. We're going to get these two sons. We're going to really come to know later. The son of Haggith. The fifth was Shephattai, son of Abital. The sixth was Eastrim and David's wife Eglon. These were born to David at Hebron. Now more sons will be born to David as he takes on more wives. Never good, but nevertheless, this was life at this time. This was just the way things were. Verse 6, during During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner kept acquiring more power in the house of Saul. Now, this is important to understand this thing right here, because his son Ishbosheth is going to be too weak to understand this. But it's also you're going to see why God did not want this union. And we see this later. Verse 7. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth questioned Abner, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Kind of a foolish thing right here. Abner was very angry about Ishbosheth's accusation. Am I a dog's head who belongs to Judah? Now keep the insult right here. Notice this. Now, who's in Judah? David, right? So he asked, all this time I've been loyal to the house of your father Saul, to his brothers and to his friends, and haven't handed you over to David. But now you accuse me of wrongdoing with this woman. Now, just understand, as we see the politics here, and you can even look at different scenarios in politics today. When people get power, they don't have to be king, by the way, to have this kind of power. All they have to have is the heart of the people. And we see that with one particular Republican, right? Why Republican leaders are afraid of a former president, because what? He has the heart of the people, or at least on the Republican side. So Abner had the heart of the people. The people were with Abner, and Abner was content not to be the king because he, in a sense, had the real power. Verse 9. And notice he said, I haven't handed you over to David. That shows you he had power. Verse 9. May God punish Abner and do so severely if I do not do for David what the Lord swore to him. Now that's even more amazing. Abner admits right here to fighting against God's purpose. Right? And he's doing this for his own power. Now watch this. In other words, he's the power behind Ishbosheth. Okay, forgive me again for pronouncing these names. May God, verse 9 again, may God punish Abner and do so severely if I do not do for David what the Lord swore to him. Now, first of all, Abner could not do anything for David, and certainly not in God's stead, right? Verse 10, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish the throne of David over Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. Ishbosheth could not answer Abner because he was afraid of him. And we see that today carrying out in the political world. Verse 12, Abner sent messengers as his representative to David, whose land is it? Make your covenant with me, and you can be certain I am on your side to hand all of Israel over to you. David replied, good, I will make a covenant with you. However, there's one thing I require of you. Do not appear before me unless you bring Saul's daughter Michal here when you come to see me. Now, kind of funny that this is the only thing that David wanted. And David is not really seeing the folly of the union. Thank God, for David's sake, God will see it. Verse 14, and David sent messengers to say to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, give me back my wife Michal. I was engaged to her for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins. Now, if you go back and think about this, that Saul had given Michal, his wife, thinking that this would be, if David go out and try to get the 100 foreskins, he would be killed. Saul double-crossed him still and then gave his wife to another man. And it's interesting here that Saul is thinking about this years later. It's interesting here. Now, Michal was not a godly person. She was a bad wife, to be sure. And that's interesting because now we're going to see. He wants his wife back. And so verse 15, so Ishbosheth sent someone to take her away from her husband, Patal, son of Laish. Her husband followed her weeping all the way to Baram. Abner said to him, go back. So he went back. In other words, go back, don't get into trouble. Abner conferred with the elders of Israel. In the past, you wanted David to be king over you. Now take action because the Lord has spoken concerning David through my servant David. Through my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the power of the Philistines and the power of Israel's enemies. Now let's stop here because this is important. What is interesting about this? What is interesting about Abner's plot? Remember, he's going to be the power behind. And the fact that he is acknowledging that God's prophecy, that God's will was made known, that David would be king. And for 2 years now, as of yet, for 2 years, he never supported David until he got mad at Ishbosheth. Okay. Verse 19, Abner also informed the Benjamites and went to Hebron to inform David about all that was agreed on by Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. When Abner and 20 men came to David at Hebron, David held a banquet for him and his men. Abner said to David, let me now go, and I will gather all of Israel to my lord the king, and they will make a covenant with you, and you will rule over all you desire. So David dismissed Abner, and he went in peace. Now, this is what if you think about this, what you did not see is David inquiring of the Lord. You don't see David inquiring of the Lord. Okay, is this a good covenant? Verse 22, just then David's soldiers and Joab returned from the raid and brought a large amount of plunder goods with him. And Abner was not with David in Hebron because David had dismissed him and he had gone in peace. Now, you remember Joab's brother, which is David's nephew. Remember, Abner killed him. Okay, so that's important to this now. Verse 23. When Joab and all his army arrived, Joab was informed Abner, son of Ner, came to see king, and the king dismissed him, and he went in peace. And Joab went to the king and said, what have you done? Look, here, Abner came to you. Why did you dismiss him? Now he's getting away. You know that Abner, son of Ner, came to deceive you and to find out about your activities and everything you were doing. Then Joab left the king and sent messengers to Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah, and David was unaware of it. Now, Abner really did seek to bring the kingdom under one roof under David, but for the wrong motives. And then they brought him back to the well of Sirah, but David was unaware of it. Verse 27. When Abner returned to Hebron, David pulled him aside in the middle of the gateway, as if to speak to him privately, and there Joab stabbed him in the stomach. So Abner died in revenge for the death of Asahel, Joab's brother. So that was Joab's motive. Had nothing to do with the kingdom, had nothing to do with righteousness, had to do anything but just simple revenge. Now, on the other hand, what we also see here is this was good that this union did not happen, because had this thing succeeded, then just think of how Abner would have, who knows what Abner would have done. Abner was power thirsty. He had controlled Saul's house through Ishmael. Then who was to say he wouldn't have tried to overthrow the kingdom of David and restore the house of Saul. Right? Verse 28, David heard about it later and said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. May it hang over Joab's head and his father's whole house, and may the house of Joab never be without someone who had the discharge from a skin disease, or a man who can only work a spittle, or someone who falls by the sword and starve. Now, it's kind of funny because even though David is saying that, David never did anything about Joab. And in a lot of respects, as we're going to see, that Joab, it really isn't a lot, it was the same as Abner. Joab never desired the kingship, but he did, and he also maintained that he would his power over the military, that he ruled and reigned there. Okay. Verse 30. Joab and his brother Abishai killed Abner because he had put their brother Abishai to death in the battle of Gibeon. So this is a grievous because at a time of peace they killed him simply because of vengeance. Now, if you stop and think about it, in war, right, people die, and when war is over, that is the time when you lay down the swords. They didn't, and that's why I said Joab is acting the same as Abner. Now, the difference between Joab and Abner, Joab had no desire to rule the kingdom, only the military. Okay, Abner had desire to rule the kingdoms behind the scenes. Verse 31, David then ordered Joab and all of the people who were with him, tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourn over Abner. And King David walked behind the funeral procession. And when they buried Abner in Hebron, the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb, and all the people wept. And the king sang a lament for Abner. Should Abner die as a fool dies, your hands were not bound and your feet not placed in bronze shackle. You felt like one of the victims. You felt like one who falls to a victim to criminals. Now, what's amazing, he's insulting Joab, but as we will see, he will never do anything about Joab. Okay. All right. All the people wept over him even more. Then they came to urge David to eat bread while it was still day. But David took an oath. May God punish me and do so severely if I tasted bread or anything else before sunset. And all the people took note of this, and it pleased them. In fact, everything the king did pleased them. And on that day, all the truth and all of Israel were convinced that the king had no part in the killing of Abner, son of Ner. So then the king sent his soldiers. You must know that a great leader has fallen in Israel today. As for me, even though I am the anointed king, I have little power today. These men, now notice this, these men, the sons of Zeri, are too fierce for me. May the Lord repay the evildoers according to his evil. Now, I don't know why he felt that. When we talk about military powers, however, then yeah, you could say that there is great power here when you sway the people, but Joab and them didn't necessarily do that. They were his nephews, and I don't know why he felt that he could not put them in check, but he didn't. All right, chapter 4. When Saul's sons, Ishbosheth, heard that Abner had died in Hebron, his courage failed and all of Israel was dismayed. Saul's sons had two men who were leaders in the raiding parties, one named Baanah and the other one Rechab, sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite of the Benjamites. Beerothite was also considered part of Benjamin. And the Benjamites fled to Gittont and still live there as foreigners to this very day. Saul's son, I missed something here. Let's see. Okay. All right. I thought I missed something here. All right. Verse 4. Saul's son Jonathan had a son whose feet was crippled. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan's came he was 5 years old when the report about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. Then the one who had nursed him picked him up and fled, but as she was hurrying to flee, he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. Rechab and Bunah, the sons of Remal and the Beerothite, set out and arrived at Ishbel-beth's house during the heat of the day while the king was taking a midday nap. They entered the interior of the house as if to get wheat and stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Benab escaped, and they had entered the house while Ishmael was lying on his bed in the bedroom and stabbed and killed him. And then they beheaded him and took his head and traveled all the way to Arabah that night. They brought Ishmael's head to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here, the head of Ishmael, the son of Saul, your enemy, who intended to take your life. Today the Lord has granted vengeance to the Lord, the king, the vengeance to my lord, the king, against Saul and his offspring." Bad mistake for these guys here. Very bad mistake. But David answered Rechab and his brother Bana, sons of Rimmon, the Beerite, "As the Lord lives, the one who has redeemed my life from every distress. When the person told me, 'Look, Saul is dead,' he thought he was a bearer of good news, but I seized him and put him to death at Ziklag. That was my reward to him for his news. How much more when wicked men kill a righteous man in his own house on his own bed? So now, shall I not require his blood from your hands and wipe you off the earth?" So David ordered the young men, and they killed Rechab and Benah, and they cut off their hands and their feet and hung their bodies in the pool of Hebron. But they took Ishbosheth's head and buried it in Abner's tomb in Hebron. So this is really a couple of things that's going on that we see wicked men first and foremost. Okay, so you start off with wicked men, and then the wicked men and God is kind of using all of this. God is using this, and we will see that there will always be tension between the house of Saul and the house of David. Again, hint, hint, just like we see kind of election today. Isn't it amazing? But I do digress. I'm just thinking about this. It's amazing. The correlations here between Republicans and the Democrats. But I'll say no more. But there will always be tensions between the house of Saul and the house of David. We're going to see this years later that they will never ever forgive the house of David. They will blame the house of David for the downfall of their father Saul. And but God, in his wisdom, saw fit to see that you can see here that it was wise for God not to allow this kind of union to happen. And part of this was separating the house of Saul from the house of David so that David could have free reign and not be bound by all of the ligaments of the house of Saul. that would have happened had that union, had he made the covenant, or put it like this, had the covenant went through with Abner and all the, let's think of the trouble that would have followed because of that. All right, guys, we'll pick it up with chapter 5 in the next study.